For 5 years, I sacrificed everything to fund my brother's dreams, believing in his potential. Then came the lawsuit. He claimed I stole his future. But in court, I didn't bring a defense. I brought a single folder that proved his future was actually a debt he couldn't escape. This is where the story truly begins, and you won't want to miss what happens. Make sure you're subscribed to see it through to the end. We're always curious. Where in the world are you all watching from today? Let us know in the comments. The migraine had started somewhere between the scrutiny of the third quarterly audit spreadsheet and the flicker of the fluorescent light above my cubicle. But by the time I pulled into my driveway, it had evolved into a living thing. It was a pulsing, rhythmic hammer striking the back of my left eye. I sat in the car for a moment, the engine ticking as it cooled, just breathing in the silence of the garage. It was Friday night. I was 38 years old. I was a senior forensic accountant for one of the largest firms in the city, and I was exhausted in a way that sleep couldn't fix. All I wanted was a hot shower, a glass of water, and the dark. I stepped out of the car, my heels clicking on the concrete, the sound echoing too loudly in the small space. I gathered my bag, the leather strap digging into my shoulder, and unlocked the door into the mudroom. The house was quiet. It was always quiet. It was a beautiful house, a colonial I had bought 3 years ago, but sometimes the silence felt less like peace and more like insulation. I walked into the kitchen and dropped my keys on the granite island. The mail was piled there from the last few days, bills, flyers, a wedding invitation from a cousin I hadn't spoken to in a decade. I ignored it all, reaching for the tap to fill a glass. Knock, knock, knock. The sound was sharp, authoritative. It wasn't the tentative rap of a neighbor returning a wayward package, nor the rhythmic pounding of a delivery driver. It was 3 distinct, hard strikes against the front door. I froze, the glass halfway to my mouth. It was 8:15 p.m. I wasn't expecting anyone. My stomach tightened, that instinctive, primal alarm that rings when the sanctity of your home is breached after dark. I set the glass down and walked to the foyer, checking the peephole. A man stood on the porch. He was wearing a nondescript windbreaker and holding a large manila envelope. He looked bored, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. He didn't look dangerous, just bureaucratic. I unlocked the deadbolt and opened the door a crack, keeping the chain engaged. "Can I help you?" "Margaret," he asked, looking down at a clipboard. He didn't use a last name, just the first, reading it with a monotone indifference. "Yes." "Margaret redacted," he verified, checking the address on the paper. "Yes, that's me." He nodded, reached into the crook of his arm, and slid the manila envelope through the crack in the door before I could even react. "You've been served." He turned and walked away before the envelope even hit the floor of the foyer. I stared at his retreating back, the cold evening air rushing in through the gap. "Served?" I whispered the word, but it felt foreign in my mouth. I had never been sued. I paid my taxes early. I followed every zoning law. I was the person who corrected the cashier if they gave me too much change. I closed the door and locked it, my hands trembling slightly. I bent down and picked up the envelope. It was heavy, thick. The return address was a law firm I didn't recognize, somewhere downtown. I carried it to the kitchen island, the migraine suddenly forgotten, replaced by a cold dread pooling in my gut. I tore the tab open. Plaintiff, Lucas redacted. Defendant, Margaret redacted. Nature of suit, breach of fiduciary duty, misappropriation of estate assets, constructive fraud. I read the words, but my brain refused to process them. Lucas, my brother, my baby brother, whose rent I had paid 5 days ago. I flipped the page, my eyes scanning the legal jargon, looking for the narrative, the why. The plaintiff alleges that the defendant, acting as executor and trustee, did willfully and maliciously withhold investment opportunities. Diverted funds intended for the plaintiff's business ventures into personal real estate holdings. Demands immediate restitution in the amount of $450,000 for lost potential earnings and emotional distress. The room seemed to tilt. I gripped the edge of the granite counter, my knuckles turning white. $450,000. I looked at the date on the signature page. It had been signed 2 days ago. 2 days ago, Lucas had texted me a picture of his new workspace setup, a high-end gaming monitor and a custom mechanical keyboard, and said, "Thanks for the transfer, sis. Big things coming." He had texted me that while the ink was drying on a lawsuit, accusing me of fraud. A sound escaped my throat, a rag. Jed, incredulous laugh that sounded more like a sob. I wasn't sick, and I wasn't dying. But as I stood there in the empty kitchen of the house I had worked 18-hour days to afford, reading the lies my brother had sworn to be true, I felt something vital inside me snap. The betrayal was worse than the diagnosis itself. I sank onto one of the bar stools, the thick stack of papers splayed out before me like a dissected corpse. I read it again. And again. The language was vicious. It painted a picture of a tyrannical older sister hoarding the family wealth, starving the brilliant, budding entrepreneur of the capital he needed to change the world. Constructive fraud, I read aloud, the words tasting like ash. I reached for my phone. My thumb hovered over Lucas's name. My first instinct, the instinct ingrained in me since I was 9 years old and he was a crying toddler with a scraped knee, was to fix it. To call him and ask what was wrong, to ask if this was a mistake, if someone had stolen his identity. He signed it, a voice in my head whispered, "Look at the signature. That's his looping L, that's his jagged S." I dialed anyway. I had to hear him say it. The phone rang. Once. Twice. 3 times. Usually he picked up on the second ring, especially on Fridays, which was usually when he asked if I wanted to order takeout on my card, of course. It went to voicemail. "Yo, this is Lucas. I'm probably building the next big thing. Leave a message." I didn't leave a message. I hung up and stared at the screen. A notification popped up, a text from 3 hours ago that I hadn't seen because I was driving. "Lucas, don't try to call me, Margie. Claire said legal counsel advised no contact. We'll see you in court. Hope the house was worth it." Margie, he hadn't called me Margie since we were kids. And Claire. Of course. I stood up and paced the length of the kitchen, the adrenaline finally overriding the shock. I walked to the living room window and looked out at the dark street. They thought I was the villain. They thought I was the one hoarding gold. I thought about the last 5 years. I thought about the vacations I didn't take. I thought about the car I drove for 3 years past its prime because Lucas needed a new laptop for his graphic design phase, then a high-end camera for his photography phase, then a server rack for his crypto phase. I walked back to the kitchen and looked at the lawsuit again. Paragraph 14 claimed that our parents' estate, which I administered, was valued at over $1 million and that I had hidden half of it. I laughed again, harsh and dry. $1 million? Mom and Dad were school teachers. They had a modest life insurance policy and a house that was mortgaged to the hilt when they died in that crash. After the funeral costs, the debts, and the repairs needed to sell their house, the estate was barely enough to keep us afloat for 2 years. But Lucas didn't know that. Or rather, he refused to know that. Every time I tried to show him the spreadsheets, he would wave his hand and say, "I'm not a numbers guy, Margie. Just handle it. I trust you." He trusted me to be his ATM. And now that the ATM had finally signaled insufficient funds last month when I told him I couldn't fund his trip to Bali, he decided to break the machine open. My eyes fell on a specific line in the affidavit. The defendant has consistently refused to provide written accounting of the trust's disbursement. My heart hammered against my ribs, but the panic was beginning to recede, replaced by the cold, analytical calm that made me excellent at my job. I was a forensic accountant. I tracked hidden assets for Fortune 500 companies. I found money that cartels tried to bury. Lucas and Claire had made a fatal miscalculation. They assumed that because I was his sister, I was casual with the paperwork. They assumed that because our arrangement was family, it was off the books. I looked at the filing cabinet in the corner of my home office, just visible through the open door. But they had forgotten one crucial thing. I whispered to the empty room. I walked into the office and unlocked the bottom drawer. It was labeled simply, LUCAS. I didn't open it yet. I didn't need to. I knew exactly what was in there. Every receipt, every transfer confirmation, every email. And most importantly, the document from 4 years ago, the one printed on heavy bond paper, the one Lucas had groaned about signing because he was late for a date, the one he had likely scrubbed from his memory the moment the ink was dry. They wanted a paper trail. I was going to give them a highway. To understand why this hurt so much, you have to understand the history. I wasn't just a sister. I was the frantic, 29-year-old surrogate mother who had been handed a shattered 20-year-old boy when our parents died. The accident had been sudden. 1 minute we were a normal family, the next it was just me and Lucas. I was already established in my career, living in a small apartment in the city, climbing the ladder. Lucas was a sophomore in college, drifting, unsure of himself, fragile. When the police came to my door that night, my life as an individual ended. I became the shield. I moved back to our hometown to handle the house. I let Lucas drop out of the semester because he was too grieving to focus. I didn't argue. I held him while he cried. I paid for the therapy he went to 3 times and then quit. I absorbed the debt from the funeral. For the first year, it was survival, but then it became a pattern. I can't go back to regular college, Margie, he had told me over breakfast one morning, a year after the funeral. It's too stifling. I need to create. I have this idea for an app. I wanted to say get a job. I wanted to say finish your degree. But looking at him, he looked so much like Dad. He had Dad's eyes, that soft, pleading look that always melted Mom's resolve. Okay, I had said, I'll help you, but we need a plan. That was the beginning. The plan shifted every 6 months. First, it was the app. Then it was a bespoke furniture business. I bought $4,000 worth of tools that are still rusting in a storage unit. Then it was day trading. I covered his rent. I paid his health insurance. I gave him a stipend so he wouldn't have to work a minimum wage job that he felt was beneath his creativity. I did it because I was terrified of losing him too. I did it because I thought I was buying him time to heal, not realizing I was buying him the rope to hang me with. Enter Ralph. Ralph had been Dad's poker buddy, a grisly, no-nonsense attorney who specialized in contract law but knew a little bit about everything. He had helped me with the probate. About 3 years ago, I was sitting in Ralph's office, signing some papers for the sale of Mom's car. Margaret, Ralph had said, peering over his reading glasses, how much are you giving the kid this month? Just enough for rent and utilities, I said defensively. He's close to a breakthrough on his streaming channel. Ralph had sighed, a long, rattling sound. You're a smart woman, Margaret. You find missing money for a living. How is it you can't see the hole in your own pocket? He's my brother, Ralph. He's a dependent, Ralph corrected. And dependents turn nasty when the bottle runs dry. You need to protect yourself. I had dismissed him then. I thought Ralph was cynical. I thought he didn't understand the bond of 2 siblings who had survived a tragedy. But then, 6 months ago, Lucas met Clare. Clare was polished. That was the first word that came to mind. She was 26, worked as a lifestyle consultant, whatever that meant, and had a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She was beautiful, sharp, and incredibly attentive to Lucas. The first time I met her, we were at dinner. I was paying naturally. So, Margaret, Clare had said, swirling her Pinot Noir. Lucas tells me you manage the family trust. That must be a lot of work. It is, I said briefly. Though it's not really a trust in the way you're thinking, it's just what's left. Clare exchanged a look with Lucas, a look I didn't like. It was a look of shared secrets, of a conversation held in private that I was now intruding upon. Well, Clare smiled, showing perfectly whitened teeth. Lucas has so much potential. It's a shame he's been so limited by, budget constraints. Imagine what he could do if he had his full share. His full share? I asked, putting down my fork. Claire, the money I give him comes out of my salary. The estate cash ran out 2 years ago. She laughed. It was a light, tinkling sound that felt like ice hitting glass. Oh, Margaret, you don't have to play poor with us. We know how much the house sold for. We know about the investments. Lucas told me everything. I looked at Lucas. He was staring at his plate, refusing to meet my eyes. Lucas, I asked, what did you tell her? I just said Mom and Dad left us well off, he mumbled. I didn't want to look like a mooch, okay? So you lied to her. I didn't lie, he snapped, finally looking up, his face flushed. I just inferred that there was more, and honestly, Margie, there should be. You're always buying nice things. You have this house. Where did that money come from if not the estate? I work, Lucas, I practically shouted. I work 60 hours a week. Claire placed a calming hand on Lucas's arm. Babe, don't get upset. She's just protective, we understand. She looked at me, her eyes cold and calculating. We just want what's fair, Margaret. Lucas wants to start a life. We're thinking of getting a place together, a nicer place, and we'll need the capital. That was the turning point, that dinner. I saw it in Claire's eyes. She didn't see a boyfriend, she saw a payout. And she had convinced Lucas that I was the villain standing between him and his rightful fortune. I cut him off the next week. I told him I couldn't support the lifestyle anymore. And now, here I was, staring at a lawsuit drafted by a lawyer Claire undoubtedly found, claiming I was a thief. I picked up my phone again. This time, I didn't dial Lucas. I dialed Ralph. He answered on the second ring. Margaret, it's Friday night, you okay? No, Ralph, I said, my voice steady now. You were right. The dependent turned nasty. What did he do? He sued me, constructive fraud. He wants nearly $500,000. There was a silence on the line. Then, I heard the distinct sound of a chair squeaking as Ralph sat up. Okay, Ralph said, his voice shifting into professional gear. Do you have the documentation? I looked at the locked drawer. Ralph, I have receipts for the gum he bought in 2019. Good, bring the folder to my office Monday morning. We're not just going to dismiss this, Margaret. We're going to teach him a lesson about forensic accounting. One more thing, Ralph, I said, a cold smile touching my lips for the first time that night. Yeah. He forgot about the loan agreement. Ralph chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. They always do, kid, they always do. Monday morning arrived with a sky the color of bruised slate. I stood in the lobby of Ralph's building, a monolithic structure of glass and steel that smelled faintly of lemon polish and intimidation. In my hand, I held the folder. It wasn't just a collection of papers anymore. It was a weapon, forged in the fires of my own meticulous nature and sharpened by betrayal. I took the elevator to the 14th floor. Ralph's office was a time capsule, a stark contrast to the modern exterior. It was lined with mahogany bookshelves that sagged under the weight of legal texts that hadn't been opened since the 90s. The air smelled of stale coffee and old dust, a scent I found oddly comforting. Ralph was sitting behind his desk, looking like a crumbling mountain. He didn't stand when I entered, he just gestured to the leather chair opposite him. You look like hell, Margaret, he said, his voice a gravelly rumble. I feel like I'm auditing my own life, Ralph, I replied, sitting down and placing the heavy folder on the desk between us. I didn't sleep much. Good, anger keeps you sharp, sleep makes you soft. He reached for the folder, his thick fingers tapping the cover. Is this it? That's everything, I said, my voice steady. Bank statements from the estate account going back 5 years. My personal bank statements showing every transfer to Lucas. Copies of the emails where he requested funds for specific business expenses. And the document. Ralph opened the folder. He flipped past the spreadsheets, past the highlighted bank transfers, and went straight to the document I had clipped to the back. It was a single page, dated 4 years ago. The paper was slightly yellowed at the edges. He read it in silence. The only sound in the room was the hum of the HVAC system and the ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. I watched his eyes scan the lines. Loan repayment and capital advance agreement, Ralph read aloud, a slow smile spreading across his face. He looked up at me over his glasses. He signed this. He did, I nodded. It was right after the first year. The estate money was getting low, and he wanted a lump sum of $30,000 for server infrastructure. I told him I couldn't just give it to him. I told him that from that point forward, any money I gave him was a loan, to be repaid when his company became profitable or within 5 years, whichever came first. He laughed at me. He said, "Margie, you're so corporate." "Fine, whatever. Give me the pen so I can get back to work." "And the terms?" Ralph asked, looking back at the paper. 5% interest, compounded annually. And a clause that states if the funds are used for non-business related expenses, the entire principal becomes immediately due. Ralph chuckled, a dry, rasping sound that turned into a cough. "He didn't read this, did he?" "No," I said softly. "He never reads the terms and conditions." "Well," Ralph said, closing the folder with a satisfying thud. "This changes the landscape. They're suing you for withholding assets. We're going to countersue for breach of contract and debt recovery. But Margaret, to trigger the non-business clause, we need proof. Concrete proof that he didn't buy servers." I leaned forward, the forensic accountant in me taking the wheel. "That's the other part of my weekend. I didn't just find the contract, I followed the money." I pulled a second, thinner folder from my bag. I ran a trace on the transfers. Lucas isn't smart with money laundering, Ralph. He transferred the server money to his personal checking and then used his debit card. I can't see his bank statements directly, but I can see the transaction codes from the transfers I made to him labeled business capital and then cross-reference them with his social media posts from the same dates. I opened the second folder. August 12th, $4,500 transfer for graphic design software. August 14th, Instagram photo of Lucas and Clare at a VIP table in a club in Miami, bottle service, tagged location. Ralph nodded, his eyes narrowing. October 3rd, I continued, $6,000 for marketing campaign. October 5th, a photo of a new purebred French bulldog on Clare's feed. Caption, "New baby, thanks Uncle Lucas." "You have them," Ralph said, leaning back. "But we need more. We need to know who is driving this. Lucas is pliable. This smells like someone else's ambition." "Clare," I said, the name tasting bitter. "Find out who she is, Margaret. Find out why she needs the money so badly." I spent the next 3 days doing exactly that. I took personal leave from work. I turned my dining room table into a war room. I wasn't just a sister anymore, I was an investigator. I used public records, social media archives, and the specialized databases I had access to through my certification. What I found wasn't just debt, it was a pattern. Clare wasn't a lifestyle consultant. She was an unemployed marketing major with 3 failed LLCs in the last 4 years. I found a small claims court filing from a landlord 2 counties over, unpaid rent, damages. But the kicker was a civil suit from 18 months ago. A breach of contract suit involving a startup investment from an ex-boyfriend. It had been settled out of court, likely for pennies, but the pattern was identical. She found someone with access to cash, convinced them to invest in a vague future, and then bled them dry. Lucas wasn't a partner to her. He was a host, and she was the parasite. By Wednesday evening, I had built a timeline that overlapped Lucas's requests for money with Clare's debts. It was a perfect match. Every time she had a payment due, Lucas suddenly had a business emergency. I sat back in my chair, the glow of my laptop screen illuminating the darkroom. The sadness I expected to feel, the grief for my brother's innocence, wasn't there. It had been burned away by the cold, hard clarity of the math. Numbers didn't lie. People did. I called Ralph. "I have it. I know where the money went." "Good," Ralph said. Because they've scheduled a preliminary mediation for Friday. They want to see if we'll settle before it goes to trial. They're expecting you to panic and write a check. I'm not writing a check, Ralph, I said, staring at the photo of Lucas and me from 10 years ago that sat on my desk. I'm writing an invoice. The mediation was held in a conference room at the opposing counsel's office, a firm that advertised on billboards and late-night TV. The room was mostly glass, designed to feel open and airy, but to me, it felt like an interrogation box. I sat on one side of the long oval table, Ralph beside me. On the other side sat Lucas and Clare. Lucas looked terrible. He was wearing a suit that didn't quite fit, one I recognized from Dad's old closet, tailored poorly. He refused to look at me, keeping his eyes fixed on a notebook in front of him. Clare, however, looked ready for a gala. She wore a sharp white blazer, her hair perfectly blown out, her makeup flawless. She stared at me with a look of defiant entitlement, her hand resting protectively over Lucas's on the table. Their lawyer, a man named Mr. Henderson who smelled of expensive cologne and desperation, cleared his throat. We are here to discuss the misappropriation of the estate of David and Sarah Redacted, Henderson began, his voice oily. My clients are prepared to drop the fraud charges if Ms. Redacted agrees to an immediate disbursement of the remaining assets, calculated at $450,000 plus legal fees. Ralph didn't even look up from his notepad. He just doodled a small geometric shape. There are no remaining assets, Mr. Henderson. The estate was closed 3 years ago. The funds were exhausted on debts and the plaintiff's living expenses. We dispute that, Clare interrupted. Her voice was sharp, cutting through the professional veneer. We know there's money. Margaret has a new house. She has a new car. She takes trips. That's Lucas's money. I looked at her then. I have a job, Clare, a career, something Lucas might have if he hadn't spent the last 5 years ideating. Don't speak to my client directly, Henderson snapped. I'll speak to my brother, I said, my voice rising slightly. Lucas, look at me. Lucas flinched but didn't look up. Lucas, I said, softer this time, do you really believe I stole from you, after everything? You controlled everything. Lucas suddenly burst out, his head snapping up. His eyes were red-rimmed. You made me beg for every cent, Margie. Submit a request, Lucas. Where's the invoice, Lucas? It was humiliating. Mom and Dad left that money for us, not for you to act like my boss. I acted like your boss, Biquet. You were spending it like a child, I shot back. We are not here to discuss family dynamics, Henderson interjected loudly. We are here to discuss the missing funds, if you cannot provide a full accounting of the estate. Oh, we can provide an accounting, Ralph said. He stopped doodling and reached into his briefcase. He pulled out a single, thick binder. He didn't slide it across the table. He just let it rest under his hand. This binder, Ralph said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble, contains a forensic audit of every penny Margaret spent as executor. It shows funeral costs, mortgage payoffs, and $47,000 in direct transfers to Lucas for his business. $47,000 is a fraction of the estate, Clare scoffed. Where's the rest? The rest, Ralph said, went to the mortgage on the family home before it was sold and the debts your parents carried. But that's not the interesting part. Ralph opened the binder and pulled out a stapled packet. The interesting part is the business capital audit. He slid the packet across the table. It landed in front of Lucas. What is this? Lucas asked, his voice trembling. Page 3, I said. January 14th. You requested $2,500 for web hosting and domain acquisition. That same day, a charge for $2,480 appeared on a debit card linked to the transfer account. Was it GoDaddy, Lucas? Lucas went pale. It was the Sapphire Spa and Resort in Scottsdale, I answered for him. A couple's package with champagne service. Clare stiffened. I saw her hand tighten on Lucas's arm, her nails digging into the fabric of his suit. We are not here to audit my client's spending. Henderson argued, though he looked suddenly unsure. The money was his to spend, it was his inheritance. Actually, Ralph said, delivering the blow we had been waiting for. It wasn't. Ralph pulled out the final document, the loan agreement. According to this contract, signed by Lucas 4 years ago, any funds disbursed after the initial 12-month probate period were classified as a loan, contingent on business use. It explicitly states that personal use of these funds constitutes a breach of contract. Ralph leaned forward. You don't just owe the money back, son. You owe it with interest. And since you used it for vacations and handbags instead of servers, the immediate repayment clause is in effect. The silence in the room was absolute. It was a vacuum, sucking the air out of their lungs. Lucas stared at the document. I never signed that. You did, I said. In the kitchen, you were eating a bagel, you were in a rush to meet a potential investor. Who was actually Clare, wasn't it? Clare stood up, her chair scraping violently against the floor. This is a trick, you forged this. It's notarized, Ralph said, calm as a grave. By the bank manager down the street. I have the notary log. This is Bull's **T, Clare screamed, her composure shattering completely. She turned to Lucas. You told me there was no paperwork. You told me she just gave it to you. I forgot, Lucas stammered, looking between me and Clare, terror in his eyes. I didn't read it, I just signed it. We're done here, Henderson said, closing his folder quickly. He looked at his clients with the disdain of a man who realized he wouldn't be getting paid. I need to review this document. You do that, Ralph said. We'll see you in court. The drive home from the mediation should have felt victorious, but it felt hollow. I had cornered him. I had proven he was a liar. But the look on his face, the sheer, unadulterated panic when Clare screamed at him, stuck with me. They didn't drop the lawsuit. That was the surprise. I expected them to fold, to scurry away into the dark. But 2 days later, Ralph called me. They're doubling down, Ralph said, sounding baffled. Henderson withdrew as counsel, smart man, but they found someone else. A guy who chases ambulances. They're claiming the contract was signed under duress. They're claiming you manipulated Lucas while he was grieving. Grieving? I asked, pacing my living room. It was 4 years after the funeral. Desperation makes people creative, Margaret, and Clare, she's dangerous. She's not fighting for the money anymore. She's fighting for survival. If Lucas goes down, he takes her with him. The escalation began on Tuesday. I was at work in the middle of a presentation to a client when my boss knocked on the glass wall of the conference room. He looked pale. He beckoned me out. Margaret, he said, keeping his voice low. We received a call from a journalist. They claimed they're running a story about a senior partner here defrauding a family trust. My blood ran cold. It's a lie, David. It's my brother. He's unwell. We're in litigation. I believe you, David said, his eyes sympathetic but firm. But you know the firm's policy on reputational risk. You need Ed to fix this, fast, or we'll have to place you on administrative leave. I walked back to my desk, my hands shaking with a rage I hadn't felt before. This wasn't just a family squabble anymore. They were trying to destroy my livelihood. They were trying to burn my world down because I refused to let them live in it for free. I called Ralph, file the countersuit today. Already done, Ralph said. But Margaret, we need the nail in the coffin. We need to prove the duress claim is a fabrication. We need to prove that Lucas wasn't a grieving, manipulated boy, but a willing participant in the fraud. I went back to the data. I had to go deeper. I spent the next 2 nights listening to old voicemails I had saved. Hundreds of them. Lucas asking for money. Lucas bragging about his business. And then I found it. It wasn't a voicemail. It was a video. It was from a family Christmas party 3 years ago, one of the few times Lucas had come over without asking for cash immediately. I had been testing out a new camera. I had left it recording on the mantelpiece while we were in the kitchen. I pulled up the file on my hard drive. I scrubbed through the footage of us eating, opening gifts. And then, at the 45-minute mark, I left the room to get dessert. On the screen, Lucas stayed in the kitchen. He pulled out his phone. He dialed a number. "Hey babe," he said to the phone. "Yeah, I'm at the ATM. I mean Margie's house." He laughed. "Yeah, I signed whatever she wanted last week. Who cares? It's just paper. She's desperate to keep me happy. She feels guilty about mom and dad. I can get whatever I want out of her." Yeah, I'll get the money for the deposit. Don't worry. She thinks it's for a marketing retainer. She's clueless." I sat there, frozen, watching the pixelated image of my brother laughing at my grief. Laughing at my guilt. She feels guilty about mom and dad. He knew I blamed myself for not being there that night. He knew I was overcompensating, and he had weaponized it. He wasn't a victim of my control. He was the architect of my exploitation. I saved the clip. I backed it up to the cloud. I backed it up to a thumb drive. The next morning, I received a notification. The court date had been set for the following week. It was an expedited hearing for the dismissal motion. I called Ralph. "I have something for the judge," I said. "I have the proof that he knew exactly what he was doing." "Is it a document?" Ralph asked. "No," I said, looking at the freeze frame of Lucas's smirk. "It's a confession." The stakes were no longer about money. I didn't care about the $47,000 anymore. I cared about the truth. I cared about exposing the rot that had been festering in my family for 5 years. I wasn't going to court to defend myself. I was going to court to excise the tumor. "Bring it," Ralph said, "and wear your best suit, Margaret. We're going to end this." The courtroom was smaller than I expected, a windowless chamber that smelled of floor wax and stale anxiety. It wasn't the grand, cinematic Hall of Justice I had seen on television. It was a place where lives were dismantled in fluorescent-lit banality. I sat next to Ralph, my hands clasped so tightly in my lap that my knuckles were white. On the other side of the aisle, Lucas sat hunched over, looking smaller than I had ever seen him. He was wearing the same ill-fitting suit, but now his tie was crooked, a physical manifestation of his unraveling. Clare, by contrast, was electric. She was whispering furiously into the ear of her new attorney, a man named Mr. Blanton who had hair that looked like a plastic helmet and a suit that was too shiny. Blanton was nodding vigorously, his eyes darting toward me with predatory gleam. "All rise," the bailiff intoned. Judge Keller entered. She was a woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that had seen every variation of human greed imaginable. She took her seat, adjusted her glasses, and looked down at the docket. "Redacted versus redacted," she read, her voice bored. "Motion to dismiss and counterclaim for debt recovery. Mr. Blanton, you're new to the file. Do you need a moment?" "No, Your Honor." Blanton stood up, buttoning his jacket. "We are ready to proceed. We intend to show that the so-called contract presented by the defense is void ab initio. It was signed under extreme duress. My client, Lucas, was a vulnerable young man, grieving the loss of his parents, manipulated by a controlling older sister who held the purse strings of his inheritance hostage. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks. Hostage. I had held him while he cried. I had paid for his therapy. I had shielded him from the foreclosure notices on Mom and Dad's house. Blanton continued, his voice rising in theatrical outrage. Ms. Margaret Redacted didn't act as a sister. She acted as a predator. She forced him to sign away his rights to his own family money. Just to buy groceries. That is not a loan, Your Honor. That is extortion. Judge Keller looked at Ralph. Counsel. Ralph stood up slowly. He didn't have Blanton's energy. He moved with the slow, deliberate weight of a glacier. Your Honor, Ralph rumbled, we have heard a very touching story today, a story about a helpless boy and a wicked witch. He walked to the defense table and picked up a thick, black folder. It wasn't the same one from the mediation. This one was new. However, Ralph continued, walking toward the bench, stories are for bedtime. Courts are for evidence. The plaintiff claims he was grieving and manipulated into signing the loan agreement 4 years ago. He claims he didn't understand what he was doing because he was so distraught over his parents. Ralph handed the folder to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. Inside that folder, Your Honor, you will find a transcript. And attached to the exhibit list is a USB drive containing the source video for that transcript. It is dated December 24th, 3 years ago, approximately 1 week after the contract was signed. Lucas's head snapped up. He looked at the folder, then at me. Confusion clouded his eyes, then a flicker of recognition. He remembered the party. He remembered the kitchen. "Play the video," Judge Keller ordered, nodding to the clerk. The room went silent. The large monitor on the wall flickered to life. The image was clear, my kitchen, warm and bright with Christmas lights. The sound of Bing Crosby singing White Christmas was faint in the background. Then, Lucas walked into the frame. He looked healthy, happy. He was holding a glass of eggnog. He pulled out his phone. The audio was crisp. "Hey babe," the digital Lucas said, a smug grin on his face. "Yeah, I'm at the ATM. I mean Margie's house." In the courtroom, the real Lucas sank lower in his chair. He covered his face with his hands. "Yeah, I signed whatever she wanted last week," the video continued. "Who cares? It's just paper. She's desperate to keep me happy. She feels guilty about Mom and Dad. I can get whatever I want out of her. Yeah, I'll get the money for the deposit. Don't worry. She thinks it's for a marketing retainer. She's clueless." The video cut to black. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. It was the sound of a narrative shattering. Judge Keller didn't look up immediately. She opened the folder Ralph had given her. She read the first page, the transcript of the vile words my brother had spoken while eating my food and accepting my gifts. She read it slowly, her finger tracing the lines. Then she looked up. She didn't look at Blanton. She didn't look at Clare. She looked directly at Lucas. Her expression wasn't angry. It was one of profound, exhausted disappointment. "You really thought this would work?" she asked. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried to every corner of the room. "You really thought," Judge Keller continued, tapping the folder, "that you could come into my courtroom, claim emotional distress and duress, while there is video evidence of you mocking your sister's grief and premeditating the fraud." "Your Honor, Blanton tried to interject. "Sit down, counsel," Judge Keller snapped, her voice like a whip. "Unless you want to be sanctioned for bringing a frivolous suit, you will sit down and be quiet." She turned back to Lucas. "Mr. Redacted, you are not a victim, you are a con artist, and not a very good one." Then the explosion happened, but it didn't come from the judge. "You idiot!" The scream tore through the room. Clare had jumped to her feet. Her face, usually a mask of composed beauty, was twisted into a rictus of pure rage. She wasn't looking at the judge, she was looking at Lucas. "You told me it was airtight," she shrieked, pointing a manicured finger at him. "You told me she had no proof, you said she was stupid." "Clare, please," Lucas stammered, reaching for her. "Don't touch me," she recoiled, slapping his hand away. "Do you know what this means? Do you know how much debt I have? I needed this payout, Lucas. I needed this to clear the loans." "Order," the judge banged her gavel. "Order in this court." "He's broke," Clare yelled at the gallery, at the judge, at anyone who would listen. "He has nothing. He's been living off her for years, and he told me he was a trust fund kid. He's a loser." "Ms. Redacted," the bailiff moved toward her. "I'm leaving," Clare grabbed her purse. She looked at Lucas one last time, her eyes filled with nothing but contempt. "Don't follow me. Don't call me. Dealing with you was the worst investment I ever made." She stormed out of the courtroom, the heavy doors slamming behind her with a sound like a gunshot. Lucas sat alone at the table. Blanton was furiously shuffling papers into his briefcase, clearly preparing to disassociate himself from the disaster as quickly as possible. Lucas didn't move. He stared at TH. Space where Clare had been standing. The silence returned, but this time it wasn't tense. It was pitiful. Judge Keller cleared her throat. I have seen enough. The plaintiff's case is dismissed with prejudice. Furthermore, on the counterclaim, I am finding for the defendant. She looked at me, her eyes softening just a fraction. Judgment is entered against Lucas redacted in the amount of $47,450, plus statutory interest and legal fees. A repayment plan will be garnished from any future wages. She banged the gavel. Court is adjourned. I stood up. My legs felt weak, but my spirit felt light, unburdened for the first time in 5 years. I looked at Lucas. He was weeping. Not the manipulative tears he used to get money, but the ugly, silent sobs of a man who had stripped himself bare and found nothing underneath. I didn't go to him, I didn't comfort him, that part of my life was over. I turned to Ralph. Let's go get lunch, Ralph, I said. I'm buying. The fallout was swift and absolute. Without the prospect of the lawsuit payout, and with his wages now subject to garnishment, Lucas's house of cards collapsed within 48 hours. Claire blocked his number before she even left the courthouse parking lot. We later found out she had skipped town, moving 2 states over to live with a cousin or her next mark. Lucas was evicted from his apartment 3 weeks later. I didn't intervene. When the landlord called me, because I was still listed as an emergency contact, I simply said, I am not a guarantor on that lease, and hung up. It was the hardest thing I had ever done. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to save him, to write a check, to find him a place to stay. But I replayed the video in my head. She's clueless. I replayed the courtroom scene. You loser. I realized that saving him was what had destroyed him. My support had been the crutch that allowed his legs to atrophy. If he was ever going to walk, he had to crawl first. 2 months passed. I was in my garden, pruning the hydrangeas. It was a Saturday, crisp and cool. The migraine that had plagued me for months was gone. I was sleeping through the night. I had even started dating again, a nice architect named Ben who paid for his own dinner and asked me about my day. I heard a car pull up. It wasn't a sports car or a luxury rental. It was a beat-up Honda Civic, rusting at the wheel wells. I stood up, wiping the dirt from my gloves. Lucas walked up the driveway. He looked different. He had lost weight. He was wearing jeans and a t-shirt, stained with what looked like paint or grease. He looked tired. He looked older. He looked like an adult. He stopped at the edge of the grass. He didn't come closer. He respected the boundary. Hi, Margie, he said. Lucas, I nodded, keeping my expression neutral. I wanted to bring you this. He reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope. He walked forward and placed it on the retaining wall, then stepped back. What is it? It's a money order, he said. $500. It's the first payment for the judgment. I looked at the envelope, then back at him. Where are you working? I got a job with a landscaping crew, he said, looking down at his hands. They were calloused, the nails dirty. It's hard work, minimum wage plus overtime, but it's real. And Claire, I asked. He flinched, a shadow of pain crossing his face. She's gone. You were right about her. You were right about everything. He took a deep breath, and for the first time in years, he looked me in the eye. I'm sorry, Margie, not because I lost, but because of what I said in the video. You gave up your life for me, and I laughed at you for it. I was a monster. The apology hung in the air between us. It was raw, and it was real. I took off my gloves. I walked over to the wall and picked up the envelope. It felt heavy, heavier than the check for thousands I used to write him. This was sweat equity. This was dignity. Thank you, I said. I know I can't fix it, Lucas said, his voice cracking. I know I can't ever go back to how it was, but I want to pay you back, every cent, even if it takes me 10 years. It might take longer with interest, I said, a small, sad smile touching my lips. He managed a weak chuckle. Yeah, I read the contract this time. He hesitated, shifting on his feet. I miss you, sis. I miss Mom and Dad. I felt so alone, and I wanted to be someone I wasn't so I didn't have to feel it. I know, I said softly. I missed you too, but the brother I missed wasn't the one who sued me. I know, he nodded. I'm trying to find him again. He turned to leave. He didn't ask to come in. He didn't ask for water. He didn't ask for a loan. Lucas, I called out. He stopped and turned. I'm making a roast for dinner, I said. If you want to stay, just dinner, no business, no money talk. Hope, fragile and tentative, lit up his eyes. I'd like that, I'd really like that. We weren't fixed. We weren't the same. The scar of the betrayal would always be there, a thick ridge of tissue over the memory of what we used to be. But as I watched him walk back toward the house, wiping his boots carefully on the mat so he wouldn't track dirt into my foyer, I knew we were finally on solid ground. I had lost a dependent, but I might just be getting my brother back. And for the first time in my life, my bank account and my heart were balanced.